All right. Am I on? Good, I'm on. Hello. Okay, good evening. It is good to see everybody here tonight. I hope everybody's enjoyed the rainy day. And we're going to have some nice balmy weather for the next few days. It'll be exciting. I don't think we're supposed to have a white Christmas, but can't have it all. Current series we're doing, and tonight we're going to be talking about really the family life in the Greek and Roman world, and a little bit about the Jewish world. And then the second half of our series that we're starting now next week, pay attention because I'm not going to tell you it's the end of class because you'll be asleep. Next week, you're perfectly fine to come in here and sit in your usual spots because the elders have got an uber exciting performance for you next week. Tony is going to break dance on the stage in there. I hope you're prepared for that, Tony. And so his orthopedist will be as well. But no, the elders will be doing our traditionally around Christmas Day week. We have the elders do the Wednesday night service, sort of like our ministry leaders did a few weeks ago for Thanksgiving. And this year, it's on actual Christmas Day. So we will have class, and you guys are the fortunate ones. You just come to your usual seat, and all the other minions have to come and find themselves a seat in here. And so I know many of you will be traveling and may not make it. That's why we do it, so that our children's teachers, youth teachers, and nursery workers do not have to worry about being here on a holiday. And so there's no nursery, no anything. Every human being that at this church has to be in this room except for people working security. And then the following week we'll pick this back up, but then we will start in January after New Year's Day. The next week I think is when we'll start looking particularly at Paul's journeys and some things that we need to know contextually to be able to properly understand those. And so tonight we'll primarily look at family life, and that'll entail quite a bit. And so this is very important. I think that as we've gone through this series, I've emphasized this is we cannot look at the Bible with 21st century lenses. We can bring the meaning and the teachings of Scriptures into our society, and that's a task that every society that has Christians in it across this planet has to figure out how to do. And they're very different than we are. Some of today's societies are very close in nature to the biblical era. We are not. And it's very important as we look through these things that we keep our contextual bearings. And I say that about family life in particular because I have heard a lot of teachings on marriage and parenting that are not contextually accurate with Scripture. They have been taken out and looked at with the marriage lens of 21st century or 20th century American marriage and parenting. And they couldn't be any different. Other than married people had sex back then and had children. That's about the similarities that we would have with those things. So we have to be very cautious of taking things out and doing that. And so thinking through some of these things, some preliminary thoughts that we have to think about. There are some similarities. I don't want to say that there's not a single similarity with these things. It was a marriage between a man and a woman, and they did have children, and they did have relationships with each other. They did have to take care of those children, but not as long generally as maybe you're accustomed to in our society. In many ways, men's and women's roles were somewhat similar, but somewhat different in our society, but there's a whole lot more differences than there are others. Also, we need to remember one of the diseases that I hear in Christian teaching is the assumption that everything was the same all the way across the Greek and Roman world and in Palestine. There would have been a great deal of difference between family life in Nazareth and family life in Jerusalem and family life in Alexandria, North Africa, and family life in Rome. Okay, there would be differences between those. Just as there are differences in family life across Europe and North Africa and the Middle East today, there would have been differences, and especially between Jewish households in Greek and Roman households. So not uniform. It's just kind of like when you hear somebody say about the Jews in the New Testament world, all the Jews believe this about a Messiah. That couldn't be further from error or closer to error if it wanted to be. Not all Jews believed in the same thing about a Messiah to come. A great variety of things believed about that. And so we have Roman, we have Greek, especially like as we think about where Paul traveled. Most of Asia Minor that he goes to are Greek cities. We would not say that about Galatia or Galatia as we call it. They were settled by Gauls from Central Europe. But Ephesus, along those cities along the coast, where many of them were founded as Greek colonies. So there's a stronger Greek culture there, a blend. And as you move west, you get a more Roman culture. The language begins to change. Some spoke Greek, some spoke Aramaic, some spoke Latin as we go across those things. So we think about during the time of like Trajan, for example, when the Roman Empire was at nearly its fullest extent. You think about those of you that are geography hampered, I can't help this, but if you think all the way from Spain over to modern day Iraq and Iran, all the way from mid-central Europe, including the southern part of Great Britain and the North African coast, can you imagine all the different cultures, all the different people that the Romans conquered, and they had different cultures, different family life. And Christianity eventually flourished across this entire area, especially in North Africa and northern part of Egypt. In that area right there, Alexandria was the same hub of Christianity that Antioch was over in Syria. So can you imagine how widespread the different thoughts about family and life, religion, because religion was an extremely ingrained part of these people's lives, very different maybe from what we have today, where our religion is kind of on Sundays and Wednesdays, but not really else. Religion permeated these people's lives, and I'm talking about the Gentile world, and of course the Jewish world as well. And so a lot of differences, a lot of different religious beliefs across this territory that we go through. You also had wealthy, and I have changed this word poor in every other slide, and I forgot to change it here to common, because I think it's misleading for me to say the word poor. Now, for a lot of these people that we're talking about, by our standards, they would be very, very poor. I'm talking about at or below subsistence level. For what we would say in our modern vernacular, at or below poverty level, meaning they're just barely getting enough to eat every day or not getting enough to eat every day. And so I really see wealthy and common, because wealthy was about 5% and about 95% it was everybody else was generally common. And then when some percentage of those were slaves. But family life was very different, and we can kind of relate to that today as well, for wealthy and for those who may not have that same kind of means, especially the household, what was comprised, the household was comprised of different. We talked a little bit about these things last week. The house was also a place where honor and shame was known, and how they did things in a household could bring honor or bring shame upon a family. And also many households may have been patron-type households and had clients that relied on them. So that's a part of family life as well. And we're also talking about a very pragmatic world, meaning there's not a lot of frills to life for most common people. It is the daily grind until you die. You know, it's not, we don't have a concept of Social Security or Medicare or retirement for most people. And most people didn't live as long as many of us hope to live today. But a very practical world. Children learn very practical things. There's not a public education system per se like we're accustomed to, especially not for most common people. And so I hear people talk about Jesus going to school. Maybe not. I think he learned how to do woodworking is probably what he learned how to do. And obviously at some point he learned how to read. Now maybe Jesus could read supernaturally. I don't know that. But he obviously could read because he reads in the synagogue in front of a bunch of people. He's a public speaker too, a great public speaker. But we're talking about a world where people were taught what they needed to do, what they needed to get through life for many of the common people. Wealthier people would be better educated. I think Paul was from a wealthy family. Maybe not uber wealthy like a senatorial or equestrian class family, but somebody that had enough money to teach him and have him be taught in Greek rhetoric, in Greek poetry, in reading Greek, in writing Greek at a very high level, in his public speaking skills. He's obviously well educated in the Hebrew Scriptures. That doesn't, he says he was educated by Gamaliel in Jerusalem, and so I think Paul was from a decently well-to-do family. He calls himself a Hebrew of Hebrews, and so Paul probably experienced a different childhood and upbringing and early adult life than Jesus may have experienced, being from more of an artisan family in a very, very small village there in Nazareth. But all of them taught what they needed to know in going through things. The other thing is, we're talking about a world of limited lifespan. Very few people would expect to live into their 70s, 80s, and 90s, as is our hope today. I'm not really sure. You know, we don't ever. I don't. We want to die and go to heaven, but we also want to live a long time. But for these people, that concept was probably pretty far-fetched. Not to say people didn't, but it was just kind of not really expected. And so what you have is an accelerated lifestyle. Kids are saddled with adult things when they're in their teens, early teens, not when they're 18 and 21 and 25 do they come on, because things are thought about in more of a hurry and thinking along those lines. Jesus wasn't an old man at 30 years old, but he was approaching, and scholars differ on this, but an average lifespan between 35 and 45 years is probably about what you thought of, and we think that sounds awful young, but I want you also to think about a world with no modern medicine, no penicillin, no antibiotics, things like that, where you can cut your finger and die from it. Or we say, you know what, we'll amputate that, and the chances of you making it through that amputation without dying or getting another infection are almost none. We don't have to go very far back in our own history into colonial, antebellum South and postbellum South to find people who didn't have antibiotics and you didn't have penicillin and things along those lines, and you really just didn't live all that long. And so the thing is, things are a little bit more compressed in that lifespan. And so we think about the family home. Another caveat here that I want to tell you, most people don't realize this, but we don't know as much about the ancient world as we would like to know. Especially about, for example, we know a lot more about the Roman world than we do other things, because several writers like Tacitus or Suetonius or Dio Cassius or some others that are Roman historians, Livy, wrote these things down and gave us a history of the Roman Empire, and they give us the 12 Caesars or other writings. But here's the trick. Most of them, we only have a partial collection of what they wrote, and most of the oldest of their writings are only about 1,000 years old. They were mostly around the 10th, 11th, 12th century, are the oldest copies we have. So therefore, those copies are 1,000 years younger than when they were originally written. So who knows what kind of corruption happened to that. And many times we only have a few manuscripts of it. So when people talk about it, and I'm going to say it in here like I really am sure about a lot of these things, I want to tell you that as best we can tell is what I'm going to tell you tonight that we have. Now, we're blessed with a lot of archaeology in the past 150, 200 years that helps us out. But when people say something with absolute certainty about the ancient world, you take that with a grain of salt. I often make this illustration. If I could bring Gaius Julius Caesar forward in time and let him watch a documentary about himself, I think he'd get up and cut the TV in half with a sword. Because he'd be like, what kind of baloney is that? I never did those. Oh, I never said that. Or that is not how our life was like. I think he would be very shocked at what we have to say about the world that he lived in. Now, I think he would be all about the accolades that we might give him in that. So I want to give you that caveat is, we by no means know with absolute certainty many of these things, just like we don't know with absolute certainty a lot of stuff about our own country's history, and things were written down. It's just not the same as having a history of World War II where we've got all kinds of diaries and journals and camera tapes and all those kind of things. We just necessarily don't have it. So this is the best we can tell. But we are fortunate in the era that we live in that our brothers and sisters in Christ that lived 100, 150 years ago didn't have this information because you have archaeology really only starts firing up in the 19th century. And so Many times in homes, you may have not only a nuclear family, which I'm not an expert in family sociology, but my remembrance is that that's mom, dad, and the kids. And then extended family is aunts, uncles, grandma, grandpa, that cousins, that kind of thing. Some families, especially those who are wealthier, may have many of these people living under the same roof. I don't think for the most part that was the case with many common people. But for wealthier people, you also have their slaves that live under their roof, probably in a different part of the house, or the domus, as it's called in Latin. And you also have freed persons. Now, I think that can explain what that word means without really explaining it to you. But many times in a patron-client system, you may have had slaves that worked for you because they were working off a debt or whatever it winds up being that they were doing, and they're freed. Well, when I free them, let's just say Rick was my slave. I don't desire that, Rick. Unless you really want to do some work for me for free. In doing it, freed Rick. Rick may remain a client of me, meaning he may still remain living on my property and land, and he may owe me some allegiance and loyalty because he may continue to work for me and be paid. But many times, where else are they going to go? It's not as if you're freed from being a slave and you're just going to go back and just find you a house somewhere and do it. You may wind up staying bonded to that family unit in a different relationship, but still bonded to them. And so you may also have freed persons that may be part of the overarching household that you would have in that day. But for most people, there's kind of a little bit smaller home. Wealthy homes that were big enough, common people's homes only had like 1 room or 2 rooms in them. So there's only so divided you can be. But in wealthier homes, you may be divided by status, not necessarily by gender, but by status. Slave, freed person. Children may have access to certain parts of a home. Children were very low status in that society, so houses sometimes would be different. We're kind of used to a house where everybody can go, throughout the whole house. We're not used to segregated houses in that area. A common home, and you guys have probably seen pictures of this. I was looking around for some to throw up here, but I just really can't find anything that I can really tie to a certain period of time. But in general, you can envision a 1-room house with probably a hearth for cooking and preparing things. Most people reclined. They didn't sit in chairs. The Lord's Supper painting by Da Vinci is baloney. They didn't sit in chairs and at tables. They reclined at things. But you would have a place for preparing those. Sometimes they may have a small courtyard outside that maybe they grew vegetables in, or if they owned a couple of small animals, they could keep them out there in that courtyard. That may greatly depend if you're in an urban environment or a more rural. Often they would have a roof that could be accessed by maybe an external stair. We think about Jesus' miracle of the man who was paralytic that they dug through the roof and they lowered him down into the room, and the room was packed full of people and getting through it. I've often wondered about that homeowner, how irritated he was that somebody dug a hole in his roof. But hey, well, now that you can walk, pal, why don't you get up there and fix my roof? And get up there while your buddies dug through my roof. But a mud thatched roof on it, maybe a place where we go. Peter had a vision out on the roof of Simon the tanner before he goes and meets with Cornelius. So you can kind of remember some narrative from the Bible that covers that. But for most people, they've also uncovered some, I would say, apartment-style living. You didn't have 10-story apartment buildings back then or 5-story, but you may have things that would be maybe a 2-story thing where you had an apartment type. Many of you may have seen ruins or pictures of ruins where it looks like the housing is like a tic-tac-toe board, a lot of shared walls when you're in a limited amount of space. I mean, keep in mind, even in ancient times, like with Jericho, we're talking about a city that was like 12 acres in size. If some of you have been to Israel, places like Megiddo, they're really not much bigger than maybe 10 times the size of this room. Ancient cities were not that big, but you go somewhere like Rome and everybody's packed in like sardines, just like today. They may have been shared walls, and everybody threw their excrement out in the ditch in front of the house, and their water source was probably nearby. But common homes were a little bit more simple than what we may imagine if we watch some movie like Ben-Hur or something. The honor of a family and the prestige of a family was the sum of its parts. Each family member could bring honor to the house, but they could also bring shame upon it, especially if they weren't ones who children were not obedient, and children means adult children as well. And so keep in mind, it's very important that the family honor not be desecrated by individuals with them. we've talked about this already. Our individualistic mentality in the United States is not the normal thing in Jesus' time. Whether you look at Greek or Jewish or Roman homes in life, there's no I in team. I've often said there's no we either. But there's no I in team here for people. It's really not about you. It's about everybody. And how is this family going to get along? What are you going to contribute to the family at any age? It's one of the reasons that children, very, very, very young children, were not really all that worried about them because they couldn't contribute very much. But I can bet you, and I'll be willing to, hopefully I'll find this out for sure, at 12 years old, Jesus was probably a major contributor to the household. He had probably already learned his Father's business, and not just his Father in heaven's business that he was teaching at the temple, but his father Joseph's business, and could probably work circles around anybody in this church except Albert when it comes to woodworking and things along those lines. And so he was ready to enter the post-pubescent adult world thinking. But everybody's got to contribute. Everybody's got to learn how to clean up. Everybody's got to learn how to grow plants. Everybody's got to learn how to take care of animals. Everybody's got to learn how to do that because we're all pulling for the big win. And if somebody doesn't pull, it just doesn't work along those lines. Everybody has to fill their roles in a society. Most people were married. Scholars believe that it was pretty normal for people to be married because the more people you got pulling in the right direction, the better off you are. It was very, very normal to do that and perhaps pull resources together. Having children was very important for most people. Their family name is going to continue. For wealthy people, inheritance was very important for land. So most people were married. You would also have in Greek and Roman households, obviously not in Jewish households, except for maybe some Hellenized Jews, and I'll explain that in a second. You also had household deities. Keep in mind, be thankful you are a monotheistic religion because not only did they have the Olympus gods or the Olympian gods, you also had household deities. Sometimes you had your ancestors that you may have a shrine set up to. And now you had to keep up with a lot of deities if you were in pagan religion. And I'm glad I don't have to do that. I'm glad I've just got one Yahweh to remember and to honor. I'm thankful for that. Now, I mentioned a minute ago Hellenized Jews. After the Greeks took over most of the known world under Alexander the Great, in Palestine, there are many of the Jewish ethnicity who wound up converting over to Greek ways and even following Greek gods and Greek customs and Greek philosophies. And they're often referred to as the Hellenists. And we see some of that in the New Testament. We think about like the Hellenistic widows were not being taken care of. They were despised by hardcore Jews who were like, we are not going to change and become like the Gentile world, but many of them did. They adopted a lot of the thinking, and so they left practicing what we would call maybe Judaism in Jesus' day. And so even they may have gone over to some of these things. But the household was also a place where religion was centered because it permeated all their lives. And you think about, maybe some of you don't know much about this, but even those who have even learned a little bit about mythology in high school or college, keep in mind there was a deity for everything, for fertility, for the rain to pour down, for my animals to have other animals, for my crops to grow, for the earth not to shake, for there not to be famine and drought and all these other things. They believed the gods controlled all of those things. And in some ways, I think that was beneficial. I think it was beneficial to Paul when he was speaking to the Areopagus, and they were fine with there being a God and him creating the world, and even for that God to have a son. But once he started talking about resurrection from the dead, where Greeks didn't believe in, some of them were like, this guy's a nut job. He's got to get out of it. It's not strange to them that deity created the universe and deity manages the universe and manages the weather and everything. That wasn't a strange belief to them. They're like, well, yeah, we've always thought that. We just happen to think there's a lot of them. And so family life was also complicated by this thinking. So we think about, since a lot of them were married, and I'll talk a little bit about widowhood here in a minute in thinking through that. We often, I think, in the United States, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if your marriage was arranged. I don't think my in-laws would have picked me. As a matter of fact, I know that they wouldn't have picked me for reasons I'm not about to advertise over the internet here as I'm teaching. But I was not the kind of person they dreamed about when Tracy met me in college by any means. But they didn't arrange that marriage. They eventually paid some part of it for some part of it, but I don't think it was arranged. But the concept of Mary and Joseph going to the drive-in and eating a bucket of popcorn and sipping out of the same drink and looking into each other's eyes and falling in love and dating and may not necessarily have been the case. It is much more likely that that marriage was permitted, or at the time of betrothal, permitted by Joseph's family and Mary's family, and there's some exchange of things as far as maybe a bride price in Judaism and dowries and things moved around, because you're not going to marry somebody who's going to dishonor your family. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's the old first comes love, then comes marriage. Sometimes you learn to love the one you married to. That would differ depending on your class in society, perhaps, or where you were from, Rome, Corinth, Jerusalem, along those lines. But the concept of teenagers going out on dates and everything along those lines probably doesn't exist very much, because most of the time, as I'm going to tell you in a minute, by the time a woman was 14 to 16 years old, she was already married and having children. Roman citizens were the only ones who had a recognized legal marriage by the Roman government. Everybody else, they got married by consent and by their local customs. The Romans could care less about, if people want to think about themselves as being married, we don't really care as long as you don't rebel and pay your taxes. We don't care if you want to consider that. But if you're a Jew, a non-Roman citizen, you'd be married according to your local customs. And then if you wanted to separate that marriage and get divorced, well, that's fine. You go through the Jewish leadership and get that done. A certificate of divorce, kind of like when Jesus has the conversations that we study about often, like in Matthew 19. It's their laws. There really wasn't a need for that. But when we think about, there's a lot more afforded to Roman citizens than non-Roman citizens. And we see that in Paul's example, and we'll probably talk about that as we talk about Paul. Paul had some different legal rights and protections as a Roman citizen than a non-Roman citizen. And so that was important. But as far as we can tell, the Roman government only recognized marriages between Roman citizens. Everybody else was, you get married by your local customs. You may be very different societies all through that. Most scholars think wealthy families definitely had arranged marriages because they were very strategic, financially, politically, for combining land, for protecting land. We'll talk in a minute that some women were married according to a certain custom, other women were married a different custom. I'll talk about that in a minute. Often we may arrange their marriage, just like it may have been done in feudal Japan or in Middle Age England to add to the social standing of the family. This marriage benefits our family because it raises our social standing. It helps us out. Those kind of things went on even into the history of Europe and going through that. And so that's not unusual. That doesn't mean that the husband and wives hated each other. We see a lot of these romantic movies, where I'm arranged to marry this guy, but the beautiful prince rides into town and I'm going to run away and marry him. Maybe it would have been great dishonor upon your family. And so marriage was, I don't want to say a business, but it was a strategic thing that we may have amongst the wealthy. Somebody in the senatorial class was probably not going to go marry somebody like in Jesus's class that we would go through. It just maybe not be the case in thinking through it, because it just doesn't work. People are pretty parallel. That's why the social ladder really didn't exist. It was all folded up. There was often a dowry involved with people that was probably pretty small amongst most common people. But in the Roman world, there were two Latin phrases, cum manu and sine manu, on how they were married. And those simply, y'all guys probably recognize the word manu. It means hand. So you see, manuscript means written by hand. Or we also think a mano means hand-to-hand combat. But with hand or without hand. And so I could marry a woman, and that means she comes under as a husband, she comes under my authority and my care, and she forfeits all rights to her family, money, inheritance, anything. She's married to me, and that's it. Well, that served as disadvantage for many women who came from prominent societies. So the more normal way of marriage became the sine manu, which is without hand, meaning the wife is still able to inherit or share in the inheritance of her father. She's not completely under the hand of her husband. Now, all that sounds very weird to us because I think most of us that are married, our wife still has ties to, if there is any inheritance to be done. And unfortunately, sometimes when the inheritance owes money, they at the end of their parents' lives, they may be paying out money or liquidating assets to get rid of things. She still has those ties. It's very unusual. We would think about someone marrying someone and for just the simple reason of marriage. Now, sometimes people get married and parents cut the kid off. But I'm talking about that it's very odd to us that I would forfeit all my ties to any property that my father owned. Now, this is obviously only mainly a concern with people who have any property to inherit or any fortune to inherit. For a lot of people, that really didn't make any difference. You may not want your household inheritance because you're going to be in the black or you're going to be in the red coming up. But that's weird. I just say that because I'm just telling you some things were different about how they did things. The primary goal of marriage was to produce children. Now, children did a lot of good things. They were extra workers around the house and the property. They were also ones who could inherit the family business or the family fortune or just the family name or leadership of the family. And a lot of that did center around males, but not all males. It is false to teach that only males could be in charge of anything. We have some wealthy women that are mentioned in the New Testament, people that have property that the church can meet on, or they're able to do church work like Lydia or Phoebe or some others along those lines. The primary goal was to produce children in those marriages because it just really was. And you had to keep society going and propagate society. We'll talk in a little bit about the fact that if you wanted to have 5 children that lived, you probably needed to have 10 children. And so one of the things is we think about, well, I'm just going to keep producing children. In our society, sometimes children don't survive. I realize that in childbirth or early infancy. But we expect most children to survive until they're 10 years old. It was not the expectation that half the children survived then. Interestingly, the normal marriage in Greek and Roman society was monogamous. I do not say faithful. I do not say one woman man. There's a reason that is in the qualifications for an elder. It is because they don't have a mistress, okay? And I don't think any of our elders do, by the way. I'm pretty certain of that. That they don't have a mistress. That is what that means. It does not mean they've only been married one time or any of those things that 18th and 19th century Kentucky and Tennessee people came up with. It means that they've only got one woman that they're with. And so monogamous, I doesn't mean say faithful in that way. Now, the only people that practiced polygamy were the Jews amongst the more popular society. You say, well, why do they do that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because biblical law permits polygamy. It regulates polygamy in Torah. The popular saying is, although biblical law makes provisions for polygamy, biblical narrative says it's a terrible idea. How many times do we have biblical narrative where a man has multiple wives and it always works out good? Okay? People can say what they want to about Saul, but as far as I know, Saul was monogamous and he had the only kid that turned out worth anything in the entire Samuel King's narrative. Samuel's sons were terrible. Eli's sons were terrible. David's sons were horrible, including Solomon, who single-handedly brought down the kingdom of Israel with his 1,000 concubines and wives. And so we don't have any good kids. So don't be too hard on old Saul and how he goes things. But look at David. He had multiple wives. Anybody has multiple wives, it just don't work out very good. There's a lot of arguing. Samuel's mama and his, I guess what would you call it, his stepmama. I don't know what you even call, what do you call another mama when you're in a polygamous relationship? I don't know what the right way to even call that is. Mama 1, mama 2. But anyway, the Jews, but most of the time is monogamous practice amongst Greeks and Romans. For girls, and I say girls instead of women because we don't define women, post-pubescent was when you started getting married. Now, that's illegal, I think, in our country, maybe not in some states in the Union, to do that. Probably the same states you can marry your first cousin. But this is not the norm for us to say, okay, once my daughter is able to have children, she can get married. Now, there's disagreement amongst scholars. Is that 14? Is it 16? It's not 21 and 22. Okay, it's not. And so once they're able to have children, marriage is begun to be considered, or at least betrothal. That seems very strange and unusual to us, but I want you to think back, even in our own country's history. How many 15 and 16-year-old men do you thought fought in our war for independence? For those of you in here whose grandparents may have fought in World War II, how many 16-year-old boys fought in World War II? Okay, we in our own nation's history, a very, very short, brief period in this world, have had people way younger than 18 do some amazing things. And for those 16-year-old colonials fighting against the British lobsterbacks, they probably had a 14 or 15-year-old wife back home. And so it's not that unusual for us to think through that. In a place, in a society where you didn't expect to live into your 60s, 70s, and 80s, if you're going to have children, you might want to get busy doing that. Now, the weird thing is men were often older. I don't know how old, but some think that men would be in their 20s, maybe even in their 30s, and marrying a very, very young woman who's able to bear children. That's something you get locked up for in our society, and that's good. I mean, I still can't think about a man marrying my daughter, and she's like fixed to be 21 years old this year, and I still don't think that's going to be feasible for me to allow her to be married along those lines, unless he goes through, he's going to have to sign some papers with me. And so anyway, much more accelerated lifestyle. They did not consider that weird or sick. We choose not to raise our children at a responsible level. I hear all these psychologists say children are impossible to take on responsibility in their teenage years. I would point them to the bulk majority of human history that says they're wrong. You know, the bulk majority of human history, people in their teens had a tremendous amount of responsibility. You can't argue with what do you want to choose, thousands of years of history or tens of thousands of years, whatever you want to do. That's not the case. Let's talk about Pappy a little bit here. In the Roman family, the paterfamilias, or paterfamilias, pronunciation, my Latin's not perfect, but the head of the household. And in Roman families, he would be that way. I'm not exactly sure how Jewish heads of household, meaning the oldest male, the oldest living male, in Roman society, he often had power over the entire household and property until he died, even over his adult children. You would not do things to bring dishonor upon him. I think the same thing is true of elder qualifications that we see written to Ephesus and to the Isle of Crete with Timothy and Titus, the letters to Timothy and Titus, that even the adult children are supposed to be trustworthy and faithful and obedient to their parents, because you don't want to bring dishonor upon the head of the family. And so I would say that different families, this may differ very much. For the most part, we're probably talking about wealthier families here. Otherwise, there's not much household and property to manage. But a little bit different for us, for adult children to still be under the head of the family. Remember, I know what people are thinking. Well, the Bible says a man's supposed to do what? Leave his father and mother, right? Well, guess what? The Romans didn't base their society on the Old Testament. Okay, I'm sorry that they disagree with that. And even today, that's a struggle, I know, for a lot of married couples, where the husband or the wife is still more loyal to their mom and dad than they are to their husband, and that's a source of difficulty with a lot of people. But adult children still being under the authority of the head. I'm not going to do anything that would bring dishonor upon the paterfamilias. I'm probably not going to do a job or take on a profession or marry someone that the head of the family doesn't approve. A great deal of honor in that. I don't think they would have viewed that as oppressive. They would have viewed that as like, okay, this is our society and this is how a family functions in that. He would have the highest social and legal standing in the family, and I think there's some variation amongst Greeks and Jews on that. Obviously, that's a Latin term, so it is very much centered around Roman life. Somebody. Well, whenever the oldest died, the next person started in line of that.
So, like, would siblings not have the opportunity to go off and kind of establish their own brand? Like, would the siblings stay there?
With permission of the head of the household, yeah. You could go do whatever you wanted to do. with that. Now, like I said, we know about as much about that as I know about building, skyscrapers. But, still nothing that would be, obviously we had families that would be spread out in different places, especially politicians along those lines. But nothing that wouldn't be something you say, you know what, I don't care what you think, Dad, Grandpa, I'm going to go do this on my own. But eventually, yeah, you would start up on a household, and maybe even a paterfamilias gave permission for you to start that. But hey, okay, you can do whatever you want to here and operate this way. But I do think it would still, I don't know this for sure, but I think it would still have been retained if, let's just pretend like you're that person, you could still do things to bring shame upon the head of your household, and you'd still honor that person. And so I'd have to do a little more work into exactly when did you kind of separate out and go, but you may be sent places, especially if you were in a family that had widespread political things. So that's a good question in thinking through that. Also, we want to think about defining adultery. We know adultery is either spouse cheating on their spouse, okay? I think everybody here would agree with that. Maybe not so much for men in many of these societies that we're talking about here. A wife having sex with another man, whether he's married or unmarried, would be adultery by that wife. The husband, maybe we may not. Well, that's a little bit more acceptable for the man to do that. That's not scriptural, and that's not biblical, and that's not what God would want. But keep in mind, we have societies today where that's the very same thing. That are modern industrialized worlds where it's perfectly acceptable for the husband to go out and have sex with another woman, but the wife is not expected to do the same thing. It's not, they call it a hall pass. You don't get that. It's not necessarily the normal thing for that to be the case. My understanding is, like, for example, maybe in modern day Japan, it's kind of something that's pretty normal for somebody to have a mistress, and that'd be okay, but it's not okay for, what do you call a wife's other person? A mistress? Well, I don't know what's the opposite. What's the opposite of mistress? See, they don't have a word for it. They don't have a word for that. So adultery, sometimes males were allowed to maybe get away with some more things. I don't think that was the case in Jewish society. And obviously, power and influence was used to benefit family. We'll kind of finish up a little bit. I don't have the time tonight to go into a lesson on women's place in the home. It is going to be different, and it's going to be different in different places in society, different statuses and class levels. But they're not as beat down as I think some people think. The barefoot and pregnant is not necessarily the rule for all women across all Greek and Roman society. Did they have equality with men like women are approaching having with men in the United States today? And it is absolutely approaching that? No, that was probably not the same in that way. The concept of those things, of a woman upper level of politics or woman owning a company or things like that, but they weren't all confined to the household. That's not even what that word means when most English translations say keepers in the home. That word really means rulers in the home, literally in Greek. And so women weren't beat down as some might think. This could be very different in urban societies than rural societies. Women may have opportunities to do things in the workplace, maybe even own or run a business. Very different between wealthy. See, I finally changed the name on the slide to common. I don't have poor. For some common households, you did things in the household and trained the children to do household duties and chores because that's just what it took to keep the thing running. And the husband went and worked the fields or he went and worked a job or whatever. It's just what you had to do, but it was a lot of work and a hard work to do. And you had certain duties and responsibilities along those lines. Women often worked in the family trade or even worked elsewhere. I've heard people say sometimes in the church that it's a sin for a wife to work in the household. And they just can't back that up with contextual biblical study. Widowhood was hard because women would lose. They did not have the same legal standing in most situations as men. So to be widowed was a terribly tough situation to deal with. Often younger women that were still in childbearing years would choose to remarry, but they may not choose to remarry in honor of their deceased husband. That would depend a lot on what their situation was, their socioeconomic situation after going through that. But many would remarry. Many men who, I tell you that a 30-year-old marrying an 18-year-old, that sounds weird, but remember, his previous wife may have died in childbirth. And so he may be marrying somebody else along those lines. Women were expected to train their daughters, in many cases their sons, to take care of household duties and just things that have to be done. We have to grow food, we have to maintain animals, we have to do a lot of things, in this household just to have things work, just to be simple. We kind of live in a society where our households operate a little bit differently in this. This is going to sound misogynistic, but I can't help it. I didn't rule the world back then, I can't help it. But for women, many women would truly think these things brought honor to them because they fulfilled these duties in society. Modesty, meaning in their dress and in their behavior, their industry. We even see that like in Proverbs 31, for example, back in the Old Testament. For a woman to be busy about doing things, working hard, with sun up, sundown type work, her loyalty to her family and to her gods, her love for her husband. I think that's why Paul asked for that in the household codes, and then he gives a little bit more caveat to it. Because you're a Christian now, here's why you're going to do things with your husband. And also to nurture children. Now that sounds archaic and old-fashioned, but this is archaic and how they look at it. They are expected to do it, and that would be honorable for them. I want you to think about even back in the days of the Old Testament. We're going to finish up the section I have here on children. We'll finish that up in 2 weeks because I don't want to launch into it with 45 seconds left in class. But keep in mind, even as far back as we think about some of the women we read about in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, it was shameful for them that they couldn't bear children for their husband. Now, I don't want to project Sarah and Hannah and other women in the Old Testament that were barren all the way up forward to the New Testament, like 2,000 years. But I want you to know that society didn't advance as fast. But for me to be able to bear children as a woman for my husband and my family, I looked at that as an honorable duty, not as enslavement or oppression. I viewed that as an honorable thing because that's what my duty was in society. And the husband had certain duties and children had certain duties to accomplish in their household. So I know there's a lot of things to throw at you and not a lot of pictures. We didn't do picture pages tonight, but I'm sorry, it's just a lot. We could spend a week on each one of these topics, but I know that would be torture. And so next week, remember, what are you going to do? Same seat, same bat time, same bat channel. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be back to studying this. So you get a break from me for a week. Love you all. Hope you have a good rest of your week. See you Sunday.